Good God. So yeah, it is a little warm out here in the studio, guys. I have a wee fan going here. Hope you can hear me okay, but like I said, it's hot, so it is what it is. Yeah, and speaking of what it is, look at this mamma jamma. This is a lens that I reviewed, 3 or 4 years ago now, something like that. I didn't do a video on it, so that's what we're going to be doing today. This is Tamron's SP 150-600mm f5.63 DI VC USD G2. I hope you got all of that. This is Tamron's super long telephoto lens for Canon and Nikon mounts. They were good enough to loan me this and the 70-180 as a part of this new book project I'm doing on the wild Mustangs out in Montana. And man, I was so impressed with this lens. I was impressed with it the first time, but I was so redundantly impressed with it this time around that I wanted to do its own video review. As you can see, I have it in the Canon mount. I have it on my Canon 5D Mark III. Excellent little camera. Just throwing that out there. Last time I reviewed this, I was a full frame Sony shooter. I didn't even have a full frame Canon DSLR. I was using that on my Mark 1.7D. Again, nice little camera in its own right. But the performance of the 150-600 G2 on a full frame Canon DSLR, I'm assuming it would be the same way on a Nikon DSLR full frame. Man. Anyway, let's get on with it. First, a few specs. As you can see, this lens is not small. Then again, as a 150-600mm, and I will add that the lens hood makes it deceptively large. The lens hood itself, I think, is like 5 inches across, about 4 inches long, something like that. So yeah, with the lens hood on there, it makes this thing look massive. The Canon mount, the Canon EF mount, according to Tamron, is actually only 10.2 inches long. That's the retracted configuration. 10.2 inches long for Canon. Nikon shooter is going to get a little bit of a break on that. It's going to be 10.1 inches for Nikon. Again, that's 10.2 inches or 260.2 millimeters for Canon. 10.1 inches or 257.7 millimeters for Nikon shooters. If you extend this bad boy to its full 600 millimeter focal length, that is going to be, I think, about 3 more inches added to the length. So you're going to be looking at about just under 14 inches or so total length. And then of course you add this soup bowl of a lens hood on there. That's going to add about another 4 inches onto that. So all in all, when you have this thing fully extended, you're looking at close to a 20-inch lens, which when you compare it to some other high-end telephotos like that, which we're about to do here a little bit later on, that's not totally unmanageable. In fact, it's pretty much on par with what you can expect to find. Now the weight, there again, Canon shooters, you're going to be at a little bit of a handicap here. This thing weighs 70.9 ounces. That's 2,110 grams. And Nikon shooters, you're going to shave off a little bit of body fat. You're going to have 70.2 ounces and 1,990 grams for your lens mount. Now, like I said, guys, I shot with this for about a week out in Montana and Wyoming with those wild Mustangs. Man, the sharpness on this, the autofocus accuracy, phenomenal. It was absolutely phenomenal, even at the wide and telephoto ends of the focal length, and at the wide and the small ends of the aperture range. So we're going to talk about that. I've got a lot of samples for you. Overall, the lens itself, beautiful. This is the SP. This is Tamron's special purpose line. Think of it as the Tamron equivalent of like the L mount lenses from Canon. Overall, beautiful black matte design. I love it. There's nothing bad to say about the looks. There is it's kind of busy though on the lens barrel. You have a lot of options here, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. First things first, you do have a zoom lock right here. You can lock that in at the 150, so the lens itself does not drift down. That's incredibly important to have on a lens of this telephoto length. Something that you need to pay attention to, and I actually, a few years ago, I thought I had broken this lens when I accidentally discovered this. Not only do you have the lens lock right here that you're probably used to, the zoom lock, but if you unlock that, let's say if you want to go out to, oh, let's say 300 millimeters, you just pull out on the zoom ring. It exposes that little bit of a white ring. That is a mid zoom lock, so you can actually lock this thing to any focal length from 150 to 600. That's incredibly cool. So if you accidentally discover that, like I did, no worries, it's supposed to be there. Of course, this lens is completely stabilized internally. Tamron calls their lens stabilization their vibration compensation. I feel like I always get that wrong. Yeah, VC, vibration compensation, which is always incredibly good on Tamron lenses. I think this gives you like a 5-stop, supposedly. A little bit of a cushion there for your compensation. You can turn the VC on and off completely. You also have 3 modes for the VC. You have V1, V2, V3, and mode 1, mode 1, mode 3. Number 1 is more or less an average. It's what you would think of as an all-around image stabilization. You switch to V2. That's used for panning. It's only going to stabilize the vertical axis because you're going to be mounted on a tripod and you're only going to be moving horizontally following your subject, so you really don't need the horizontal stabilization. So that is going to stabilize up and down for you. Switch it to V3. Be absolutely sure I get this right. I'm reading this right from Tamron USA's website. It says VC Mode 3 prioritizes the stabilization of the captured images and forgoes the stabilization of the viewfinder image. So I think it only engages the VC at the point of capture and not during the entire shooting experience. Of course, moving on from the VC, we have the tried and true AF and manual focus. This has full-time manual override, so even if you're in AF mode, if you just turn the focusing ring, you're going to be able to focus manually. The last button is something that if you're not familiar with a lot of telephoto lenses, you may not have saw before. This is more or less an autofocus discernment switch. You have full, which means it will autofocus on whatever you happen to be having your autofocus point on. You can switch it to infinity, 10 meters to infinity. So that is only going to let it focus on things that are more or less further away than 10 meters. So it's going to not focus on things that are in the foreground. That can be helpful, especially if you're doing sports, you're in a crowd. It doesn't confuse the autofocus quite as much. The last setting for the autofocus is the 10 meter to 2.2 meters. This is more or less the opposite of that 10 meter to infinity. This is going to exclude things in the background. So if you're actually wanting to have things that are really close up, if there's a certain runner in a race or something that you want to focus on that is closer to you, it's going to help to not confuse the autofocus with some stuff that's going on in the background. Really nifty thing to have if you have a really long telephoto like this. You'll notice here that it has a lens collar that is included with it. That is more or less to take the strain off of the bayonet, the mount, well, the bayonet of the lens as well, but the camera mount itself. So the camera is not supporting the weight of the lens is actually supporting the weight of the camera. And like I said, it just takes a lot of stress off of the mount there. I will mention this is included with the lens itself. You don't have to buy the lens collar extra. One last thing before we get into a few comparisons of the lens to some other telephoto lenses in its same class, let's talk about the weather sealing. Real quick, I'll take this off the camera. The weather sealing on Tamron's SP line, I've talked about this so much in my reviews, but it bears repeating each and every time. You have a gasket here on the lens bayonet itself that butts up against the camera, and all the points, the zoom ring, the focusing rings, and I believe even the switches on the camera itself, they're all weather sealed. That makes a tremendous difference, especially, you're going to be using this lens outside a lot, more likely than not. And man, I shot with this in the rain in Montana. Beautifully done, not a hiccup at all. The lens, when I reviewed it back, I think in 2016. What year is this? So yeah, 5 years ago now. Oof. I think I shot with it in some really foggy weather and misty weather up in the Smoky Mountains. No problems with it then either. Tamron's weather sealing, I think they call it moisture sealing or moisture protection. Absolutely A1. Oh, one thing, I will mention this before we move on to the actual samples and everything. This takes a 95 millimeter circular filter. You can use square filters. I have some 100 millimeter square filters. You'd probably be hard pressed to find a 95 millimeter adapter ring for it. I do wish that it had the drop-in filters at the rear. I do wish it had the drop-in filter feature at the rear. I think that would save you some trouble and probably some money as far as finding filters. But there again, you really can't have everything with this. And I'll point out that a lot of the telephoto lenses on the market, they don't have that feature either. Hopefully they will sooner than later. Oh, and I keep thinking of things to mention before we move on to the image samples. The autofocus on this blew me away. I'm a huge fan. Like I said, I'm primarily a Sony shooter. I'm a huge fan of the VXD autofocus that they have on their 70 to 180 millimeter f2.8. That's absolutely outstanding. This guy here though, with the 5D Mark III, and it was impressive with the 7D Mark I, it's phenomenal with the 5D Mark III. So the higher end full frame cameras, maybe not even the full frame cameras, but the cameras are more modern that have the more advanced autofocus features. You have to think my 7D, I think I got it in 2010. So that's a decades old camera now or over. So yeah, it wasn't quite as snappy as it was with the 5D Mark III. Man, this one, especially with flexible spot, incredibly fast, incredibly accurate in servo mode, at least with the Canon. It locks onto those horses and everything that I was shooting phenomenally well. Can't say enough good things about the autofocus of the 150-600mm G2. Okay folks, for the fourth time, let's move over to the actual image samples of this. It's extremely sharp. The contrast is beautiful right out of camera. The color is amazing. Honestly, I didn't see hardly any pin cushion or barrel distortions, either at 150 or 600. You can see a little vignetting at the longer focal length, excuse me, the wider focal length, so about 150 to about 250, somewhere around in there, maybe not even that. And generally you have to really do some post-processing or be shooting at a really bright object like a really bright sky or something to even notice it. And I'll mention that Lightroom has, and I'm sure a lot of the other post-processing softwares you can find too, have profiles already for the G2, so it's essentially not an issue. And speaking of Lightroom, here we are inside of Lightroom Classic. We're going to take a look at our sample images from the Tamron SP 150-600mm G2. Now, in almost every case, all of these images are going to be raw. They've had no sharpening, no import sharpening, nothing done to them inside of Lightroom. For lack of a better word, these are straight out of camera. With the exception of one, and I'll tell you which one that is. But I'm going to do my best to name off the settings of each of these pictures, but if I forget one, you just look up at the top left here and you can see the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO, and the focal length. Each one of these were shot on. Now, our first image, this is the only one that we have processed. This is the raw image. This was shot at 150 millimeters. That's the widest the lens can go. At 1/1500th of a second f4.5, that is the widest aperture this lens can go, and at ISO 200. I'm going to zoom in to 100%. Of course, these are all handheld. Let's go to 200. You can even see the individual hairs coming off this Mustang Stallion. Kind of a sad story behind this guy. I won't go into it here, but he'd actually lost his band in a fight. You can actually see some of his battle wounds still here. This is the raw, like I said, and this is the processed, just to show you what this lens is capable of. Absolutely beautiful colors to be extracted out of that, beautiful sharpness, just the tonality. Gorgeous. Now you can see, and I left it in because personally I like it in my images, this is at 150 at f4.5, so the widest aperture, the widest focal length. And you can see here, go back to the raw, you can see just a little bit of the vignetting going on, and if we really bring in that contrast and down the exposure, you can see that darkening up here at the bright points of the sky. Like I said, that's easily remedied with the profile corrections down here, at least in Lightroom. You just go to lens corrections, enable profile corrections, and boom, there you go. really does a good job at taking care of some of that, the small amount of distortion and the small amount of vignetting that was present. But again, wow, just I know it's my picture, but absolutely beautiful images coming out of this lens. Now the rest of the photos we're going to look at are going to be raw. This is at 500mm f/5.6, 1/1000th of a second, and f/200. Again, nothing done to this picture in terms of sharpness. Slightly shaky. When I say shaky, I mean not just terrible. That could have been some movement on the horse's part. But overall, again, out of camera, colors, spectacular. That bokeh in the background, actually, and it's something I've noticed with some other Tamron lenses, it actually looks a little swirly. Like I said, it could just be me. I love the Helios lenses, that bokeh swirl in the background, so maybe I see it when it's not there. Next picture, 600mm f/5.6. That's the widest you can go at that focal length, 1/1500th of a second. Zooming into 100%. I believe this Mustang's name is Tex. I'm not joking. ISO 800. Beautiful. Slightly soft, especially down here at the corners. This is the widest, again, the aperture that you can go at 600mm. As soon as you start stopping down, I think we have some, it's f/6.7 at f/7.1, I believe. You can see where that's actually starting to sharpen up quite substantially. 600mm again, 1/1500th of a second. We've stopped down to f/6.7, and look at this. You can see this little gnat, this little insect flying around. Sharpness is already coming back. Yeah. Again, keep in mind, handheld, 600mm. That vibration control, vibration compensation, that VC, really coming in handy here. Same with this next photo. And it's nothing too bad, folks, but if you're squeamish, there are some wounds on this Mustang, so just, shut your eyes for the next couple minutes or minimize your window there. This was another Mustang who was in a fight. This is at 552mm f/5.6, ISO 800, 1/1500th of a second. Look at the detail on the hair there coming down. Beautiful sharpness, even at that relatively wide of an aperture, at that focal length. Here's a non-horse picture, a landscape picture. This is at 1/1500th of a second. Apparently I was shooting a lot at 1/1500th of a second just to get that sharpness. 600mm f/5.6, ISO 800. This was, I wish I had had an image of this wide so you could see how far away this was. Honestly, I would ballpark this somewhere in the area of 3/4 to a mile away. The huge land area out there, and this was zoomed all the way in at 600mm. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. Again, this is raw. A little bit of contrast to that. You can see the individual trees way out there. You can see the contrast of the snow to the bare parts of the land. Kind of wild. And there again, you can see, even though we're at 600mm, you can see that amount of vignetting right here around the edges. We're wide open at f/5.6. I'm going to go down to the lens corrections, enable that profile again automatically. That's more or less taken care of for you here in Lightroom. A couple images to go here. Raw, 1/3000th of a second, f/5.6, 600mm, f/400. This really arrests that motion. Look at the sharpness on that. Go back out to 100%. You can see the eyebrows, the little eyelashes of the horse here. My goodness. Go back to 200. You can make out the individual striations in the iris of the horse's eye. Absolutely beautiful color. This was the little bit after sunrise that morning. Beautiful light. And our last image here, this was taken on the last day, on up in the day too. This little foal, he is more or less brand new. I believe his name is Voyager. if I'm not mistaken about that. 150mm f6.7 and at 1/1500th of a second exposure. Look at the isolation here, even at this wide, relatively wide with this lens. That's in focus. You're already starting to blur out here at the back as you move from the foreground to the midground. And of course, I think I had actually when I was here, I was with these this foal and his mother for a while. If I'm not mistaken, I'd actually moved the focus point over here to the left to kind of control the focus more so when I was framing this up. But in any case, absolutely beautifully. The autofocus locked on absolutely beautifully. See his little whiskers, see his little eyebrows and eyelashes going there. Another gnat flying around him. Yeah, so sharpness, as you can see, the color rendition, the contrast, more or less out of camera, absolutely astounding with the 150-600mm G2 and with a 5D Mark III Canon. Man, well, the results, I hope, speak for themselves. Just sort of an aside, I want to compare this lens to some lenses that I have on hand here to give you more of a real-world idea of the size of this. This is a Canon EF 50mm f1.4. I've got the lens hood on there reversed. That's a 50mm. Can you see? That's a 50mm Canon compared to the Tamron 150-600mm. This is a Nikon telephoto that I've had forever. This is a 70-300mm. What is this? F4 f5.6. I actually got this with my first SLR ever, my first film SLR ever. So that's a 70-300mm Nikon. Tamron 150-600 on the right. Yep, there you go. And I also have Tamron's Sony, this beautiful lens, maybe my top 2 favorite Tamrons of all time. The first being that, I think, 35mm to 150 for Canon that I reviewed. Check that out, love that lens. But when you look at this, again, 70 to 180mm, not just astronomically larger than this lens. 150-600, 70 to 800, excuse me, 70 to 180mm Sony on the left here. Not just a crazy amount of difference there when you take into account that that goes to 180mm, this goes to 600. Yeah, again, not just crazy big for what you get. And folks, I know that a lot of you are going to be looking at the 150-600mm and wanting to compare it to some similar lenses, whether or not you're going to be using it on a DSLR, whether it be Canon or a Nikon, or if you're going to be using an adapter, something like these, to use it on, let's say, a Sony camera. Like I've used this on my A7R Mark III with a Sigma MC11 adapter. You can do that too. Of course, you're going to have better and worse adapters depending on how much money you pay. If you're going to be using this as an adapted lens, yeah, I would say get a higher end adapter, at least, something like I said, the Sigma MC11. I actually have used this with my old Comlight adapter, which works technically with the autofocus. But yeah, something like a Metabones or, like I said, the Sigma, those adapters, maybe even some with the speed boosters in there, it's definitely going to pay off when you're using a lens of this caliber. Now, that being said, I'm actually going to compare this with 3 other lenses, and one of them is that Sony FE200 to 600mm. So if you're looking to adapt this lens to, let's say, your Sony, I'm going to give you a comparison of the specs compared to that actual native Sony lens as well. Okay, first up, we've talked about the specs of the Tamron. I've also, like I said, if you want to check out that written review over at contrastly.com, I have the specs all listed out there to give you a better look. But comparing the Tamron SP 150-600mm to the Sigma 150-600mm f5.6.3, these lenses are almost, for lack of a better word, identical, at least in their lengths and the physicality, more or less. The Tamron, again, about 4.42 pounds. Whereas the Sigma is going to be a little bit lighter, 4.03 pounds or 1,830 grams. Now the Tamron is going to beat out the Sigma 150-600mm just a tad on that minimum aperture, The minimum aperture of the Tamron is f32 to f40 depending on the focal length, whereas the Sigma, you're going to have a straight across the board f22. Now, if you want to compare the Tamron 150-600 to an actual Canon, a native Canon lens, the closest you're going to be able to come is Canon's EF 100-400mm f4.5, f5.6. That's the IS2 USM. You're going to be seeing some major differences, and that's really going to come in the form of the price. The Tamron is about $1,200. I'm looking at B&H's Compare. That is about $1,200 less than the Canon. The Canon is going to be about the same as far as minimum aperture. That's a f32 to f38, as opposed to Tamron's f32 to f40. You're going to come in big on the weight though with Canon. It's going to be more or less a pound lighter than the Tamron at 3.61 pounds, that's 640 grams, compared to the Tamron's 4.42 pounds or 2,010 grams. That's for the Canon mount. Remember, the Nikon's going to weigh just a little bit less. Something interesting to note about the Canon, that 100-400mm Canon, is that you can use more or less a run-of-the-mill filter size. It has a 77mm circular filter thread on the front, so it may be a little bit paying off in dividends not having to source a 95mm circular filter. Everything else is going to be fairly close. You're going to have the same amount of aperture blades as the Tamron. You have 9. You're going to have 21 elements in 16 groups for the Canon, whereas the Tamron is going to have 21 elements in 13 groups. And of course, the Canon is going to give you a little bit more light at the actually at all across the entire focal length. That's f4.5 when you go down to 100 millimeters. Then you're going to have f5.6 at 400. Again, that's 200 millimeters less in terms of telephoto capability. And when you kind of factor that into the weight and the overall dimensions, of course, the Canon is much lighter and it's a little bit shorter than the Tamron. It's only going to be 7.6 inches long, retracted, whereas the Tamron is 10.24. When you kind of take everything into account with, you know, you're getting 200 more millimeters as far as telephoto reach there, it's kind of to weigh it up to where, you know, if you factor that into Canons, you may be coming out even more equal with the Tamron. And last but not least on our little comparison here, you're going to be looking at the Tamron compared to Sony's FE mount 200 to 600mm f5.6 6.3G OSS lens. Man, that is just a beautifully massive lens for Sony. That one is going to be, like I said, not as much of a price difference, and I'm talking in terms if you're planning to adapt the 150 to 600mm Tamron to, let's say, a Sony full frame camera or crop sensor camera, although that would look laughably small mated to this lens. But I thought I would throw this out here anyway. The Sony FE 200 to 600mm, you're going to be looking at a f32 to f36 minimum aperture compared to Tamron's f32 to f40. Of course, if you're using an adapter, that may affect that some. You're going to have the overall length of the Sony 4.39 inches. Excuse me, that's the diameter. You're going to have the overall length of the Sony 12.52 inches, a little bit longer than the Tamron, but it's going to be oh no, it's actually a little bit more in weight as well. It's going to be weighing 4.65 pounds as opposed to the 4.42 pounds of the Tamron. Of course, if you add in the weight of the adapter, that's going to be probably another 7 or 8 ounces depending on the adapter. So yeah, the more you know, the more information you have there. So really, when you look at it, like again, this is on B&H Photos website. The Tamron, as of today, what is today? Good Lord, May 3rd, 2021, was $1,199. The Sigma 150 to 600mm f5.6.3, $899. Again, I don't quote me on this. I think Sigma either has or is working on a Mark II version of their 150 to 600mm for Canon and Nikon. That's only $899, so you'd save a little bit of money there. And I'll stop here to say that there's actually G1, of course, version of the 150 to 600 that falls into about that price range as well. Sony's FE to 600mm, that's going to be right at $2,000. That's $1,998. And then of course you have the Canon EF 100 to 400mm. That's going to be the silver tuna. Again, that's about 2,400 bucks. That's $2,399. I personally have never used the Canon EF the Canon EF 100 400mm. I'm sure, you know, it's an L series. I'm sure that that's going to perform beautifully. Whether or not it's going to perform, like I said, $1,200 beautifully over this, which you saw the sample images, and take into account the autofocus on this that I'm so impressed with, I just don't know. All right, folks, that has been my admittedly impromptu but hopefully thorough review of Tamron's 150 to 600mm f5.63 DIVC USD G2 for Canon EF mount. I know that's a mouthful. Again, this comes with Nikon, a Nikon mount as well. Of course, you can use it with adapters for your Sony camera, or I think virtually any camera you can find an adapter for. Couldn't be happier with it. As always, with a lot of these newer lenses from Tamron, I hate to send it back. Again, I'd like to thank them for letting me use it for my next project, Faces of Pryor, the Wild Mustang book on the Wild Mustang, simply Pryor Mountains out in Montana. Yeah, this is the lens that I would go to, honestly, if you need any kind of really far out reach for virtually any current mount of digital camera, whether that be DSLR or mirrorless. Sharpness, absolutely superb. Couldn't ask for any sharper, honestly, in this price range. Like I said, it's really 1,200 bucks for this kind of lens with that kind of reach, that kind of autofocus, that kind of stabilization, that kind of weather sealing, that kind of build quality, and like I said, that mid-range zoom lock. I love that. I wish a lot more people would come up with that. I don't know why a lot of people don't. Yeah, 150 to 600mm Tamron for Canon. I love it, absolutely. If you have any questions about that, guys, well, you know where to put those, down there in the comments. And I want to mention this one more time, as always, Camera Jockey Clothiers. I'm trying to get rid of all the ads for my videos, even the affiliate links. This is my t-shirt store, among other things, over on Springs. Like I said, we have t-shirts, mugs, fanny pack. I'm working on all kinds of stuff. They're weird, they're cheap, they're well made. Head over there, support me, support the channel. And like I said, I don't like them any more than you do. Help me get rid of these damn ads. All right, folks, until next time, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam Welch, and as always, I don't know how to end these videos.